FICA, the Federal Insurance Contributions Act, the dreaded payroll tax withholding that we see on our W-2 forms, or on Schedule SE of IRS Form 1040 if you're self-employed. But what exactly is FICA? What do the terms payroll taxes and self-employment taxes refer to? Are we talking about income taxes? Confusion leads to misinformation, which leads to an erosion of trust. This vicious cycle foments extremist views and ultimately can lead to governance failures and societal harm. Today, we're going to talk about a hot-button political issue that some consider a hallmark of economic security for millions of hardworking Americans, and others vehemently criticize and label as a Ponzi scheme that robs Americans of their hard-earned money. I'm Joe Pastino. Join me on this inaugural episode of Facts Over Fury as we discuss the government-funded program whose name we all recognize, Social Security. Joining me today is Dr. Richard Quinlan, Director of the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies at St. Elizabeth University and Chair of our History Department. Rich, welcome.
Thank you, Joe. Thanks for having me, and certainly thrilled to be here as we get this podcast underway and have a discussion that affects more Americans than what they probably might even fully realize of just the critical importance of Social Security.
Right. So let's get to it, because there's a lot to unpack here.
Yeah.
When we talk about FICA, we're actually referring to three very large complex programs, right? We have Social Security, we have Medicare, and we have Medicaid. Now, these programs are all inherently complex. They're very, very large. And let's be honest, they're a little bit difficult for the average American to understand. So today, let's focus on Social Security. Right? So let's start with the basics. What is Social Security and how is it funded?
Well, I think you bring up a great point about the complexity of all of these programs because they began, and Social Security certainly did, it fits into this perfectly. They began with a fairly simplistic, easy to understand concept. In 1935, as the country's in the midst of the Depression, the Roosevelt administration, as part of the New Deal, helps to introduce Social Security. Basically, a plan to say the government is not going to let you suffer and die if you are an older American who can't find work. And of course, with the paucity of jobs in the mid-30s, not to mention the Dust Bowl and the other issues facing American workers, if you were older, you were not going to be able to find employment. And so rather than simply leaving you to fend for yourself and feel lost, there was a significant shift in the way the government viewed their role in society, which was, we are going to pay you every month. We're going to give you something to live on. And the reason why that's so significant is because prior to that, and even if you look at interviews from people of this period, people who had nothing, they lost everything when the Depression hit. Their attitude was, this was my fault. I did it. I lost it. I'm going to rebuild things myself. I don't want a government handout. And Roosevelt was very adamant in his efforts to say this isn't the government just handing you money that you didn't earn. It's the government's role to protect the governed. And you see that fascinating philosophical shift beginning with programs like Social Security.
Right, and it's interesting because Social Security is something that the majority of Americans rely on, right? Even to this day.
Yeah.
I think I was reading somewhere upwards of 97% of Americans rely on some form of Social Security payments, to finance their retirement. And there's a few different pieces to this that we really need to break down and explain, right? So first is your tax dollars, your payroll taxes, are financing the retirement benefits for the folks who are in retirement right now.
Right.
And then in turn, when you are of retirement age and you start collecting, the folks who are in the workforce, their payroll taxes are going to finance the benefits that you are receiving.
Yes.
And it's interesting because there's a lot of tension there with this concept of the government is taking money out of my paycheck and I am not receiving the immediate benefit, right? Like there's enough tension with just general income taxes, right? But you have the argument of, okay, yes, you're paying federal income taxes, but you use federal government services, right? Those tax dollars are going to help with infrastructure, and they're going to the national parks, and they're going to things that we all enjoy regularly. But with Social Security, I think part of the problem is folks have it in their heads that I'm paying for something and I'm not receiving anything in return, and I may never receive anything in return, right?
Yeah, it's true, and I actually have a quick kind of funny little interesting story about that. I was taking courses years and years and years ago at Long Island University with a professor named Louis Koenig, and Louis Koenig has written extensively about the American presidency. He actually started in the Roosevelt administration. And we were talking about Social Security, and everybody has had a class with that guy, like the person who just believes that every word that comes out of his mouth is brilliant. And so this guy raised his hand. He said, well, professor, everyone in this room is paying for your Social Security. And Koenig, who by this point was an elderly man, didn't miss a beat. And he looked up and he said, well, technically, I'm still working, so I'm paying for yours. And it was such a great line, and it did sort of perfectly encapsulate what Social Security is. This guy, this graduate student, completely misinterpreted things and really did believe that sort of his toil and sweat and hard work was somehow just giving his money to people like Koenig. And Koenig's argument was, no, everybody who's still working is helping to benefit the future. And that also requires, I think, a shift in American thought, because you're so right, especially now. I think in the 30s it was more understood, but certainly more contemporary, in more contemporary times, we like instant gratification. If you're going to take my money right now, well, then I want something for my money right now. And that is part of the strain, I think, with Social Security.
Right, this idea that the benefit is so far away.
Yeah.
Right. It creates fury. People get mad over this. And, to break that down even further, the conversation that I always have with folks is, well, let's look at this, from using the big picture, right? So you're in retirement, you're in your late 60s, let's say. You're going to have a lot of expenses to pay, right? And you're not going to have a regular income. And, so folks say, well, Joe, I have my retirement plan with work. Well, okay, so let's break that down even further. Odds are you have a 401k or maybe a 403b, depending on where you work. Maybe you invested in an IRA on your own. Those investments and the return you get on those investments are based exclusively on the state of the economy, right? The market value of your benefits. So if we have a repeat of the Great Recession, for example, 08, 09, the massive market crash, all industries were affected, this huge meltdown, you maybe in 05, 06, 07, you were getting, let's say, $3,000 a month from your investments, your retirement investments, your 401k and whatever other funds you have. Well, the market just crashed. So now instead of $3,000, you're getting $1,500. Right. Is Social Security treated that way? Is it? Are the payments that you get, right, are they affected by economic downturn?
Well, we know that Social Security actually remains consistent and moves with the cost of living.
Right.
But the fascinating thing, what really floored me when we started to dive into this, is that people talk about Social Security as if you're going to be living on an island somewhere once you begin to receive these benefits. The average monthly Social Security payout is just over $1,800.
Right.
Particularly where we are in northern New Jersey and living in the Northeast, that's not taking you very far. Right. And so I think that's an important concept too, that when people think about Social Security and the criticism that they have of it, we're not funding luxurious lifestyles for people who have gone into retirement. This will aid you. It's going to be a little bit of subsistence, but it certainly is not something that's enough for people to live off of.
Right. And people don't realize that, when it comes to your financial planning, I think, financial advisors will probably tell you something along the lines of Social Security can help with maybe 40% of your costs, right? The rest of it is on you, right? So part of the scheme is it's going to provide some extra income, right? That you can then add to whatever else you have saved for retirement, right? But it's also a hedge against economic downturn, right? Because, now the example that I just gave, you used to receive $3,000 a month from your private retirement, investments. There's a market crash. You're only getting $1,500 now, but you still have that $1,800 of Social Security coming in, even though there was a crash, right? Even though the market is in the toilet, right? You're still going to get the Social Security that you were owed with your cost of adjustment, cost of living adjustments, right?
Yeah, and so again, and that goes back to its origin of not leaving people completely helpless. But there's so many misconceptions, as you well know, about Social Security. First of all, Social Security benefits that Americans receive are vastly lower than most of our surrounding peer nations. You look at places like Spain, Greece, Italy, Germany, they all have a version of Social Security that's vastly higher payouts than what we receive as Americans. Now, again, you can look at that in two ways. You could say, well, I don't want exorbitant tax rates because the money has to come from somewhere and it's going to come from me.
Right.
Or people, I'm sure, slam their fists and say, well, wait a minute. I'm living in America. I'm not living in Greece. Why would somebody in Greece or Iceland or Portugal be receiving more benefits than what I am? I should be getting more as an American. So I think this is where the anger, the confusion, the frustration emerges about Social Security.
Right. And, the other thing that folks don't realize is for your Social Security benefits, when you start claiming benefits, for those benefits to be income tax free, your, adjusted gross income is the IRS term, right? Your AGI needs to be below a certain threshold, right? So, because there are some folks who they begin tapping into Social Security, let's say when they're 67, right? But they work in, an industry where it's common to, let's say, work into your 70s, right? Like, for example, let's say they work in academia, right? There's plenty of faculty who decide to work into their 70s, right? You need to be very careful because if your income is over a certain amount, right? If you're still working, you're going to get taxed on your Social Security income, right? So, this idea that Social Security is a free ride for a lot of folks, right? Which is, an argument that you often hear more so on the folks who are on the right side of the political spectrum, right? Is that folks are getting a free ride, well, how am I getting a free ride? I paid payroll taxes when I was working before I took in my benefits, before I claimed my benefits. I'm claiming my benefits now at 67, but I'm still working. And now I'm paying taxes on those benefits again because the IRS, says that I'm making over a certain amount of money, right? So I think part of the fury, right, and part of the dysfunction that comes with this conversation of how do we reform the system, right, is that folks just don't understand all of the intricate details that go into this system.
Exactly, because it's so easy to oversimplify things for an applause line, for a quick soundbite, it's a Ponzi scheme, it's a free ride. And then what that does is obviously it stirs up the electorate and it gets people angry. And anger, fear, these are emotions that will drive people to the polls.
Right.
So it is certainly a ploy used by politicians to not, manipulate people might be too strong of a word, but certainly try to coerce people into to coming out and voting for them.
Right. Those sound bites are powerful. Now, one of my go-to money people he has a radio show, and he often refers to Social Security as social insecurity. And I always pause and I think to myself, like, you have so much financial knowledge, and you're making that comment, and comments like that, I think part of it comes from the political philosophy of folks, right? Whether they're politicians or not, there are folks who just disagree with Social Security's existence because they think that government has no place in providing retirement benefits to folks, But at the same time, last year you have the Social Security Fairness Act that was signed into law by President Biden, and that was bipartisan legislation. It's so interesting, right? Because you have all of these calls over the last 2 decades that we need to reform Social Security, and it's going broke and it's going bankrupt, and we're not going to be able to fund all of our benefits, and there's going to be a reduction in benefits because of it, and it's like there's never going to be a bipartisan consensus. Yet we just had a very bipartisan consensus last year, right? In the House and in the Senate, right? This bill passed by very large margins, right? Was signed into law by a Democratic president, and it's allowing folks, and this is what gets me, it's allowing folks who did not pay into the system, right, to collect Social Security benefits, right? So why do you think that is?
Well, again, you have the inclusion of the word fairness, and you always have to look at language when it comes to politics. And so including the word fairness in there gives this perception that we're sort of putting out this blanket to help all people, and which theoretically, and certainly I think if you maybe lean more left, you're thinking, well, that's exactly what government should do. We need to be fair, we need to be inclusive and help everyone. But it does raise a very legitimate question. This is one of those moments where you can understand people's fury, where, well, wait a second, if I've been paying into this program and I'm going to eventually recoup some money because I've spent my life working and paying into it, well, why are people who have not paid into it being allowed to collect? I mean, this is where you start to get into that very, very gray area where you start wrestling with ethics and morals versus financial realities. Because if Social Security, as we have been told, and people bang this drum all the time, is going to be bankrupt, there won't be a penny left by 2035, well then, why are we doing this? Wait a second. I mean, that is a legitimate question. You want to help people, you want to provide for people, you want to make sure that we don't have our fellow Americans, lying helpless on the street. But at the same time, are we penalizing others, in an effort to provide this kind of relief?
Right, and and that is a fair question. And I think what else we have to ask ourselves is, we were able to pass this legislation across, with bipartisanship, right? In 2005, George W. Bush tried to make a meaningful effort to reform the Social Security system, and he failed. And it was a bipartisan effort that led to the demise of his proposal, right? So how come we can pass legislation on a bipartisan basis on one side, but then when it comes to reforming the system, making meaningful reforms, right? Why is there always this struggle? Because the sound bites you're always going to hear from the left is going to say, well, the Republicans want to cut benefits, right? They want to take your Social Security away.
Social Security,
right?
yeah.
They're coming for your Social Security,
yeah.
right? And then the right is going to respond by saying they want to tax you to death.
Yeah.
Right? They want to raise the payroll taxes, and they want to go after the working man. They want to go after the small businesses, right? Because this is another point that folks don't understand, right? You as an employee, you pay half of the Social Security tax, the payroll tax. Yeah. A lot of folks don't realize that, right? Half comes from your paycheck, and the other half the employer pays, right? If you're self-employed, right, you pay the full amount. You're on the hook. So if you're a W-2 employee, right, you're paying half.
Yeah.
You're self-employed, you own a small business, right? you're on the hook for the full amount. So the right uses that, right? The Republicans use that line, and then I think everybody is unanimously opposed to raising the retirement age.
Right.
Right. I mean, now in reality, what is the big deal from an age standpoint, right? From being able to collect benefits, is there a big deal with waiting until you're 70, 67 versus 70? I mean, I don't think so, right? It'll probably have a big impact financially, right? But I mean, what's the harm in telling somebody wait another 3 years, right? But I feel like every politician is afraid to say that.
They are, and the interesting thing about that is they really shouldn't be, because the numbers prove it out that Americans, we are living longer.
Right.
People in general are living longer. I mean, frighteningly, on sort of a global scale, the American lifespan is not where we would think it should be.
Right.
Men living to about 78,
79.
And
women
women
like
make it into
82.
their early 80s. Yeah. So telling someone at 67 to say, well, can you hang on for 2.5, 3 more years, theoretically should not be that much of an issue.
Mm-hmm.
But once again, you're back to that power of language, because the two arguments that you just brought up, A, they're coming for your Social Security.
Big Brother's coming.
They're coming. They're going to be knocking on the door, taking your check.
I want to meet these they that everybody
I do
refers
too.
to.
Yeah. Or maybe we don't.
Yeah.
Maybe they are frightening.
Right.
Or they're going to tax you to death. In both cases, both sides, think about the audience that they're targeting. It is, from a purely possibly cynical political standpoint, it is a brilliant move, because you're targeting your most dependable voters, older voters.
Yes.
They show up.
They do.
And so if you're telling someone who's more conservative, look, they're going to nickel and dime you to death, maybe quite literally, they're going to show up and vote. And if you're on the other side saying, well, that monster over there is coming for your Social Security, people will turn out and vote.
Yeah.
The 18-year-old voter, the 25-year-old voter isn't thinking about Social Security.
Right.
That's not going to galvanize them to get to polls. And so politicians, I think have to make a conscious decision. What audience are you really going to try to target? Because Social Security is a winning political argument for you if you want the small business owner, the working man, that classic classic line
Right.
that politicians use, the average American, as they're now
Yes.
said,
Yes.
right? It's gone from the working man to the average American. Well, if you want the average American to show up and vote for you, Social Security is a heck of a hook.
Right. And I think that is what led to the demise of President Bush's
Yeah.
plan.
Yeah.
Right, because part of his plan was he wanted a partial privatization
Yes.
of the system.
Yes.
Right, to take some of the strain off of the government, right, and to be able to provide benefits without having to increase taxes.
Yeah.
Right, because there was no way he was doing it. I mean, increasing taxes cost his dad the election, right? So he was very hesitant to say we're going to increase the payroll taxes. And like you said, he probably was genuinely concerned about senior citizens turning out and voting against him or voting against members of the Republican Party, because you're right, as you articulated, I think that whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, if someone says we're coming for your Social Security, right, Republican senior citizens are going to come out, and if the Republican is the one that's painted as this, thief of the Social Security benefits, yeah, those senior citizens probably are going to vote Democrat.
Yeah. Yeah, and the fascinating thing is, if you go back to 2000 and you go back to the Bush-Gore debates about Social Security, they were both saying pretty much the same thing. I mean,
Right.
Gore had the famous lockbox line. That was
Right.
his, we're going to put the money, it's going to be in a lockbox
Yes.
as we safe.
No one's going to touch it.
No one's going to touch it, but they were making the same argument through two different choices of language. But you're absolutely right. And Bush, certainly in 2005, and this is a whole separate conversation, but I mean, you had tax cuts in the midst of fighting two wars, which was completely unprecedented.
Right.
And so he was not, even though he rightfully could have, because fighting in Afghanistan, the Iraq War by that point was 2 years in,
Right.
it would have been completely justified to say we've got to raise taxes. But he understood, again, going back to his dad in 92 with Clinton, it's the economy's stupid. The last thing you want to do is raise taxes. So,
Right.
yeah, this is where he was stuck. But, Joe, you've brought up so many really fascinating points about Social Security and things that people may not necessarily think of right away. Another one is how Social Security benefits children,
Right.
which I really do not think enters the mind of people when you think Social Security. It connotes that image of the retiree sitting in a park feeding the
Yes.
birds or something.
Yes.
Social Security helps elevate millions of children out of poverty every year.
Yes.
So it is a crucial program for people who are decades and decades away from the retirement age.
Right, and I think, I was reading, I think it was the Center for Budget and Policy. I think it was something, the statistic was wild. It was like Social Security payments lift 1.4 million children out of poverty every year.
Yeah.
And
older adults.
And older adults.
I mean, it's a program that if you're looking at it purely ethically, does wonderful things. And so it plays a vital role in the country where it's the world's largest economy, and you can certainly make an argument that no one in America should be hungry or homeless or suffering or starving. Well, Social Security does its part to try to make that a reality.
Right, and speaking of the benefits to children, a lot of folks may not realize that in certain situations, if, God forbid, you have a parent who dies, the children are entitled to the parent's Social Security payment, I think, until they're like 18 or 19 years
Right,
old, right? Until
right.
they're young adults. I mean, imagine losing out on that.
Yeah.
I think that a lot of the fury, again, stems from this lack of knowledge and just how much folks rely on this program for things other than retirement, right? Because I think another important piece to discuss is supplemental security income, right? There are folks who are disabled, right, who rely on the Social Security system to survive,
Right.
And it's good that we bring this up, right? Because I think the question I have for you as the historian, right, is Social Security today, has it deviated from what the designers of the program envisioned? Like, is Social Security today drastically different from what was in FDR's head when he came up with this plan?
So I would say theoretically no,
Okay.
because again, in 35, there was that concern also about children, also about people who are disabled, not just the older Americans who could not find a job. So, the Roosevelt administration had a broad spectrum of people that they wanted Social Security to help. I think the way it's deviated it's just sort of the natural evolution of life. I mean, in 1935, if you began collecting benefits at 65, let's say, and I'm not trying to make this morbid, but you could have been looking maybe at 5, 6 years
Right.
where you would have been collecting, and then people pass away.
Right.
But as we've seen changes in health and health regimes and food and quality of life, people are living longer, which means that individual collecting those benefits at say 67, if you now make it to 87, well, instead of the government paying you for 5 years, 6 years maybe, which was the concept in 1935, suddenly the government's paying you for 20 years. And that's been the biggest change. And again, this was something that the Roosevelt administration could not have possibly envisioned in 35, nor would they have concerned themselves with it.
Right.
It was, as Roosevelt said in his first inaugural, that the country's crying out for action, and he's going to deliver action. And that he actually said that he would approach the Great Depression with the furor of how we would approach being invaded by a foreign foe. And so the attitude was, we're going to do everything we can to fix this problem right now, make sure it never happens again. But Roosevelt could not have been thinking about life in America in 1985 or 95 or 2025. So, I think it's stayed relatively true to what its initial purpose was. But we have to make sure, as with any program, that it evolves as the country evolves.
Right. And I think that also is part of the frustration that folks have with, I think with government in general, but in particular with Social Security, because you have our elected officials talking about it all of the time. The political pundits are talking about it all the time. You have, like we mentioned, administrations like President Bush who tried to make meaningful change, and nothing happened, right? But how do we face the uncomfortable truth that fixing the system is going to require making unpopular decisions, right? Because as you outlined, right, the system was built or let's say designed at a time where the average person spent 5-6 years in retirement, okay? So how do we go to the electorate and say, well, look, we're living longer, so we need to raise the retirement age?
Yeah, it's an incredibly complex question because it requires actually a cultural shift.
Right.
And cultural shifts take a very long time.
Yes.
And they can be painful. And unfortunately, right now, we live in such an age where information that we receive is so frequently reduced to a quick soundbite, something coming across your phone.
Right.
For older Americans, they're seeing something on Facebook, and they believe it to be 1,000% true.
Right. Misinformation.
Right. Exactly.
Right.
And then that gets shared and spread, and the mis and disinformation grows. So I think it's really, the country has to sort of face a certain level of reckoning. But we have seen in the past what has happened when politicians are brutally honest with Americans. When Jimmy Carter's legendary malaise speech did not go over well, and he was being very blunt with the American people.
Right.
In terms of the energy crisis. I mean, there was that idea of, listen, put on a sweater. I mean, there really was.
Yes.
And that was the reality.
Yeah.
But the American people quite firmly rejected reality. And that was in the late 70s. And I don't think we have sort of collectively matured as a nation now in 2025 where we really want to hear the truth. And I think it's going to require a shift. This is one of those changes that's a top-down change. Most revolution, most change is bottom-up. This is going to require an administration to say, we're going to speak honestly, we're going to speak like adults, we're going to speak eloquently. It's not about blame, but this is the reality of the situation we face. And we come together as a country and address it, or we continue to suffer. And it can be done. I mean, normally nations rally around leadership, they rally around each other during times of tremendous crisis, but crisis usually involving war or some kind of attack.
Right, a trauma of some kind.
Exactly,
Right.
exactly.
Right.
But I referenced FDR looking at the Great Depression as if it was a foreign invader. That is the kind of language that could be used today. And you can approach domestic issues with that level of sincerity and that level of seriousness as a way of maybe kind of giving people a shock to the system and say, we can't be cute with this. This is not a time for partisan bickering and name calling and insults. This is about collective strength and success through unity. But unfortunately right now, and this is not a shot on either party, but rather on both, there's such a lack of, seemingly, I should say, lack of interest in cooperation and bipartisanship that it's just much easier for people to score political points by saying, hey, I want what's good for you. They don't. So if you're not happy, blame them.
Right.
And that's always problematic.
I mean, we saw that recently with the government shutdown.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, which, I think there's several issues that we can go into on that topic, but I think that our politicians today, and again, this is not a dig at either party, it's a dig, I think, at both parties, but I think at us collectively, right? Because, you know, with Social Security, I see two different, I guess, themes, let's say, right? So we have the younger generations, right? My generation and the generations after me, right? So I'm a millennial, and then we have Gen Z, and right? We're very used to instant gratification because of technology, right? So I push a button and something happens. Food shows up at my door. Packages show up at my door. I don't have to do anything, right? So I want it now. I want it now. You know, make it happen faster and faster and faster. Telling somebody, yeah, you know, you were going to be able to collect at 67, right? But now you got to wait till you're 70. They're not going to listen to a comment like that or take it seriously, the younger generations. And then the older generations, right, like the boomers, you know, who are either in retirement or about to enter retirement, or even Generation X, you know, you say, let's say raise the retirement age. Well, they're going to come back and say, well, you know, imagine you're in your early 60s, you know, and some of your closest family members start passing away, right? Your peers start to die, right? Or maybe somebody who's, you know, a good friend of yours, they're your same age, and out of nowhere, they get diagnosed with, you know, this terrible illness, and now, you know, they have to stay home or they're bedridden or whatever. You know, that messes with your head a little bit.
Sure.
Right? Telling somebody, well, you know, wait a few more years before you can collect these benefits, they're going to throw their arms up and say, I'm going to die before I see any of this money. You know, why should I support reforms like this that are going to very possibly, you know, either eliminate or substantially reduce the benefits that I'm going to receive because I'm going to kick the bucket before I see any of this money.
No, it's an incredibly valid point, and you do speak, you know, you definitely speak the truth there. I think coming from the perspective of someone who is you know, in the midst of Gen X, as a person in my early 50s, I don't know. Maybe it's because I'm just trying to push off aging as much as humanly possible, but I don't even think about it. And I know I'm not alone. I think a lot of us who are in Gen X, the situation that we're in is that we're really the first generation that's not going to do better than our parents.
Right.
You know, we're not going to be as comfortable as what the boomers were. And so I think there's a certain level of thought within a lot of us within my age group of just, I'm probably just going to have to work until I drop dead doing whatever I'm doing. And so Social Security to us, it's not something we think about. It's not something we talk about. Now, I think you picked a very specific age, and you were correct in doing so. Early 60s is a big difference than early 50s. Where I'll be in 10 years and my feelings about this could be in a very, very different place. As I sit here today at 52, I don't even think about the idea of retiring. I have no idea what that even means or what I would do.
Yeah.
So I think what also adds to the complexity of Social Security is that it's a person-by-person experience. And when you have programs, policies that can be treated in such an individual way, it's difficult to really speak about it effectively in a more collective manner.
Right. So we have our work cut out for us.
Yeah.
If we're serious about reform, you know, it's really going to require a level of collaboration and cooperation that I don't think we've seen, at least not in a very long time.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah, it's going to require politicians and our leadership on state levels and above really deciding, you know, is this the path we want to follow?
Right.
Yeah. Is this idea of division and just insults and name calling and this kind of very juvenile at time behavior, is this really what we want? Or are we going to begin to realize that positions of leadership, particularly when you're talking about high-level political leadership, it's not easy. Okay, this isn't a game. This isn't about being famous. This is hard work. And,
Right.
and I always say when I talk about American politics, that politics should be boring. If you are a politician and you are doing boring, grinding work, then you're doing the right thing. Because trying to reform Social Security is not a TikTok video. It's not going to generate 10 million clicks. It's hard work. And I think we've drifted from that in the sense where being a politician now means you're famous. Well, you really shouldn't. You should be known.
Right.
But there's a difference between people who know who you are because they voted for you and they have confidence in you, and being a celebrity. And we're at a point where just too many politicians are interested in being celebrities instead of, that old metaphor of lock each other in a room and just say, we're not going to leave until we've compromised. And you and I have talked about this. I mean, you go back and look at people like Tip O'Neill and Ronald Reagan, who would disagree. They would disagree on what color the sky is, but they also realized neither one as individuals were bigger than the nation. And that idea of truly putting country first, that is a sense that we have to return to.
Right, and I think part of what you have described, right, like this idea of the celebrity politician, which it's interesting because Ronald Reagan was a celebrity before he went into politics. But I feel like social media, to an extent, right, has heavily influenced, right, I think that's a good word to use, has influenced this idea of the celebrity politician because you're surrounded by all of this media creativity all the time, right? You don't even need the traditional corporate media anymore.
Right.
You could have somebody in your office or in the state capitol or in DC at the Capitol building, right, on their cell phone, recording you, and that becomes news.
Yeah.
I mean, you have all the other platforms, TikTok, X, Facebook, YouTube. You're surrounded by this all the time. Now, that's in stark contrast to FDR's time, right? Where you listened to him on the radio, right? Yep. And that was considered revolutionary. Whereas now, in theory, right, you could talk one-on-one with an elected official. Right? And I mean, I think since 2016, we've seen that, that it really, I think came to life, so to speak, right? Because you have President Trump who used Twitter as a primary means of communication, to both share his feelings, but also to make policy announcements, right? And then you had people commenting, right? And in some cases, you had responses to those comments. So now I'm looking at this, right, as the end user, I'm like, wow, like, did the president really answer me? And I'm sure there are politicians who, they hand off all that stuff to a communications team. But then again, there are probably some politicians who handle their own social media. So now, as a citizen or as a voter, I should say, I'm looking at this and I'm like, wow, I can talk one-on-one with whomever, senator, congressman, congresswoman, president, right? Nobody ever had that kind of access.
No, it's the closest we can get to truly direct democracy.
Right.
And the idea that you can have this, even though it's virtual, but it's still a one-on-one conversation. And again, contrast that with the fireside chats or Roosevelt getting mail.
Right.
Getting handwritten letters.
What is that?
A
letter?
Appealing to him for whatever the cause may be, which is why it sounds so cliche and antiquated today, even if you tell people, well, call your representative and flood their email. And actually, does it make more sense to try to use social media? And this is where I think the conundrum is that nothing or very few things in the world are ever 100%. So to label social media as 100% evil is far too narrow-minded.
Right.
But to also think it's the greatest thing ever is equally narrow-minded, because there's obviously a lot of give and take with it. You do have remarkable access, but at the same time, how is that being used? Because like you referenced President Trump with Twitter in 2016. Well, the funny thing about that is not only has Twitter become X, but now Trump has Truth Social. He has his own personal social media platform. So, but he's not speaking to all Americans through that. If you are following Truth Social, more than likely, not everybody of course, but more than likely it's because you are Team Trump. You believe in him and you voted for him and you support him. So Roosevelt spoke to all America. The Saturday morning presidential address spoke to all America. Mm-hmm. Now, you can actually specifically target, slices of America that you want to reach or who want to hear from you. And while that is on one level positive because it's intimate, the drawback there is, well, what about the rest of the country? What about that other 40, 60, 90% who aren't on your social media platform and are not getting that message? What are we doing?
Right. And, I think this is also important because this goes to bias, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you're only following the politicians that you support, right, how are you educating yourself comprehensively, right, on a complex issue like Social Security, right? Because we've gone through the nuances here, right? This is something that affects everybody, right? Retirement, Republicans have to retire the same as Democrats, right? Like, Republicans need money the same way the Democrats need money. So if you're only following a specific individual that, closely aligns with your ideology, right, or with your I guess, conception of what is correct or what government should be, how do you know you're not missing something important, right? How do you know that you have a fair understanding, an accurate understanding of the issue, right? And I think some of that helps foment some of the extremism that we see on the political left and the political right, because you're like, it's my way or the highway. My person is right, everyone else is against me, and I'm eating what my elected officials who I chose to follow are feeding me. Yeah. And dare I say it, they could be wrong.
Right.
What if they're wrong?
But we've now reached a point where there are those out there, and this again is something on both sides, this is not exclusive to either party, who believe that no, whatever my team says is right.
Yeah.
And the reality is, in terms of fixing Social Security, if you did sort of elevate the tax revenue a little bit, polls have proven that there is bipartisan support for raising that Social Security tax a little bit. The numbers, we're not going to bog people down with numbers, but if you look at the estimates over the next 75 years, sort of the gap between what Social Security will pay out and what it has is just over 1% of this country's GDP. America's economy is pretty good.
Right.
We could swing,
right,
1.2% of our GDP to help fund Social Security. And that's all it would take. But how many people are actually out there saying that?
None. They're too afraid.
Right? Because people will only hear tax increase, get out the pitchforks and start trying to raid that politician's house. The reality is, if you explain to people in a calm, rational way that we are talking about the next 75 years, the next 100 years, this means your kids, your grandkids, their kids, we can really set ourselves up for the future with relatively little effort, which you would think would appeal to Americans.
Right. Right. And I think that the same argument can be made for raising the retirement age for certain generations.
Sure.
Right? Like when I say raise the retirement age, this isn't a let them eat cake comment that I'm
Right.
making, right? If I'm saying raise the retirement age, that affects me also.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Like I'm not saying raise the retirement age for the boomers or for your generation because you're too close to retirement. That would be unfair, right? But the oldest members of my generation are 44, 45, right? What's the big deal with waiting until you're 70 to collect? Like you're 20 plus years away from being able to collect anyway. There's time.
Yeah.
There's time, right? And I mean, and then the generations after me, I mean, like the Gen Z and and then eventually Gen Alpha and all of them. You have a long time before you're going to retire, right? Like what's the big deal?
Right. Yeah. No, you're absolutely correct, and I think it needs to be presented that way. That this isn't about punishing people.
Right.
This is about, again, a sense of collective good. And can you begin to rebuild a sense of nationalism through the concept of collective good? Because you can frame this in a way that says this is Americans helping Americans. And I think if you put it through sort of a nationalistic lens, it will galvanize people. I think it really would garner support, because it's not about saying, well, I'm now ready to retire, so good luck to you. It really would be, this is going to affect Gen X, millennials, Gen Alpha,
Gen Z, Gen Beta,
whoever
all of
these
them.
kids
Yeah,
are.
That's it.
But we are doing this for the betterment of your future, and it's just going to require maturity, clarity of thought, and being able also for the American people to have enough of an attention span to say, I'm going to listen. I'm going to listen, and I'm going to really think about what my future looks like. Because Social Security helps children, it helps women, it helps people of color. It is such, there's such a broad swath of people who benefit from this program. It is too vital to lose. And it's not going to be lost if we just ask people for a small amount of reform. So.
It sounds like a very radical idea.
I know, and I do apologize.
Yeah.
I apologize for my clearly communist views by asking for that.
That's it. You want the government to be everyone's retirement fund.
Yeah. Yes, the government's going to be just one giant trust fund for all of us.
That's it. Yeah. That's it. It's, you want to give the hardworking man's money to people who don't want to work.
That's right.
I don't understand.
That's right. Those people who are working until they're 70,
right?
who have proven through all those years that they didn't want to work.
Right. I mean,
I know.
We've got to face the facts here.
This and that is the challenge.
Yeah.
Because what sounds great on paper, or what sounds easy and logical on a podcast, when you suddenly inject real life into it, people are going to punch holes in your theories.
Right, and I think an important discussion to have, that directly relates to what we're talking about, right? The difficulty with compromise, the difficulty with change, right, is how our government was constructed at the founding. Yeah. I think that we need to have a serious discussion about what it means to be a republic, what it means to have a federalist system, right? And also, to an extent, what it means to be a capitalist system, a capitalist economy, right? Because each of those can ignite a level of fury like you've never seen before, right? Because you use the word communist, right? So that immediately came to mind, right? Communism, socialism. We're seeing socialism now even within the Democratic Party, where you have democratic socialists, a little, I guess, like faction within the party. And the outcome of recent elections, in New York City, for example, or even in Congress, where you have folks like Bernie Sanders, right, and AOC, that's one small part of the Democratic Party, but a growing part of the party, right? And then you also have the opposite on the Republican side, where you have factions like the Tea Party.
Right.
Right. So how has our system of government, led to the situation, I guess, that we're in today, where we're just bogged down in, in this, this inability to pass meaningful reform on these critical issues?
Well, I think you are brilliantly setting up future episodes of this podcast.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and that's why we started this podcast,
Yep.
right? It's facts over fury.
That's right. That's
so
right.
Learn before you get mad.
Yeah, there's nothing. Emotion is great, but make sure that it's actually informed emotion, because that blind rage and that blind fury has never helped solve anything.
Exactly.
And so I think those are fascinating conversations to have. Basically asking the question, how did we get here? How did we go from 13 colonies that just didn't want to pay taxes and wanted to run their own lives to a nation that is so pluralistic, and it's our strength is in our pluralism, but we're so, as you said, bogged down in division and divisiveness and anger. And
Yeah.
so how did we get here, and where do we go?
Right. And that division is hurting all of us.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Absolutely.
So, well, Rich, this was a fantastic conversation.
My pleasure, Joe. This was so much fun. I mean, this is really fascinating material, and it affects all of our lives. And I'm just honored to be a part of this with you.
Same here. Folks, we hope that you enjoyed our inaugural podcast, Facts Over Fury, and we will be back where we talk about more controversial issues, and we're going to show you how they may not be as controversial as you think.
Can't wait. And special thank you to our good friend Brandon, who is running all of this and putting this all together. So thank you so much. Joe, my pleasure.
The pleasure is all mine.
Awesome. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.